Welcome to the Your Story is Our Story podcast, brought to you by the new3rs.org, which is dedicated to telling the social justice stories of yesterday and today. My name is Neil Foote, host of this podcast, where we will have honest, heartfelt, and heart-wrenching conversations about race and culture in our communities. This podcast is our simple way of helping you to join us in our mission, which simply says, by using stories of social justice to dismantle racism, the new 3Rs unlock civic and compassionate leadership at school, at home, and at work. We offer programs and resources to educate and empower children, parents, educators, and workplace leaders through a lens of racial justice and racial awareness. The new 3Rs educates and empowers through the art of social justice storytelling, building relationships, and fostering a sense of responsibility. We are creating a more civic and compassionate society, one child at a time. Thanks for joining us today, and remember to follow us on social at the new 3Rs. That's the new NEW, the number 3 Rs. Welcome to the second part of our three-part series where we are having a fascinating conversation with three parents in New York City who are fighting for change in one of the nation's most segregated public school systems. In this episode, Camille Casaretti, Naomi Pena, and Chino Tanikua discuss how their upbringings have influenced their parenting and how they are seeing that their children are unfortunately experiencing racism, isolation, and rejection. These moms, aka activists, also pull no punches in discussing how privilege plays an ugly role in society and in public school systems in many different ways. We'll wrap up today's episode with a Black History fact from our very own Dannie Gore Sr. Let's get into the conversation. I think you said that the key word there, journey, and each of you have addressed these unique situations that kind of drive this awareness in some point in that early stage of your life that something was a little off. It's interesting how each of you said there was something about some incident that just didn't seem right. And as with age and perspective and experience, we suddenly realize, oh my goodness, that's what was going on. And particularly at this stage of our lives, with seeing our children journey through the lives, we just wonder, it's like, wow, which I think kind of sets up perfectly this other kind of a line of conversation that talks. Now that you see this, now that you can, have this kind of wisdom behind you as a parent. How are you looking at these experiences as impacting your children and based on some of the experiences they're having, which probably is probably frustrating you all, because it's like, my goodness, wait a second, I went through this 20, 30 years ago. Why are you all experiencing the same thing now? And Camille, is how have you, as a parent and working with your children and listening to their experiences, how have you kind of manifested some of that learning and to pass it along to them, or have you changed your ways, or how has it influenced you?
What I've seen in my years in public school, and is that if you know how the system works, you can get what you want and get what you need. And so it's very challenging for me. Like Shino was talking about guilt being a strong motivator, and I have a lot of guilt about the privilege that I have as a white woman with white children, and all of the access to opportunity that my kids have had for that very reason alone. And because of that, they've done well academically. But what I am looking for in this school system is access for all children, especially those who don't have the same opportunities that my children have had. And I'm working actively to change that every single day in the system. my children were born when I was a bit older. So I had a lot of time to learn about things, years to see the world in a different way. And I really want to be able to give back like experiences and knowledge that I have. So I spend a lot of time trying to conduct a variety of parent workshops. I do that all the time. I try to create committees whenever I can to allow secession, like to, really get people involved in learning about different topics. And so I'm sorry, pause. I got sidetracked from the question.
It's all right. You're good. You're good. So we're talking about your role as a parent, what you learned as a kid, and how that's influenced you as a parent in listening to some of the journeys of your children. Naomi, why don't we bounce to you for this for the question of based on your own journey in life, how how it's influenced you as a parent, and listening to some of the adventures in quotes that your children are experiencing, which sadly so may be similar to what you've experienced in the past.
So, I think what sort of prepped me to be an advocate was because as the only English speaking child to two immigrants, basically, I was always tasked with translation, filling out forms. And to this day, my 41 years of living, my mom still calls me every year when she has to fill out her forms for health insurance or her lease. And I remember vividly going to, hospital appointments and other Spanish speaking individuals realizing that I was an English speaker and my mom's going, sure, go with that random stranger, help them translate what's going on. So I was always put in a position of having to advocate for, explain things to people and try to help them understand it to make a decision. So fast forward, I have, as I mentioned, 4 children, but my oldest, quite quickly when he started first grade, I started to, it was being told to me that he was struggling. Now I'm a first time mom, I was a different learner. And, he was having a hard time. He could not recognize his letters, was having a hard time reading. And at the end of the first year, it was told to me that A, he has to be held back because he was not reading. And 2, I should get him evaluated. There's something going on. I mean, it was to a point where the kid was like playing with paper on the floor because he just was not getting it. So, I did what I was told, navigating down this very dark rabbit hole of finding out what he needed, with evaluations and such. And as it turned out, he had a learning-based disability called dyslexia. And I then was tasked to submerge myself in what dyslexia was. Because I think when you say dyslexia, everyone thinks, oh, they reverse B and Ds when they write. And it's not that. It is literally a neurological condition that the letters themselves do not sit, like there's a stimulation out there. I'm happy to share it. But literally there's the words on the paper switch constantly. So as a struggling reader, it looks like words are literally dancing around the page because you do not have the phonetic tools that you need to help you break down syllables of each word, because we stopped teaching phonics in this country decades ago. So it started off with him going to, they told me he has to go to, he was in a charter school at the time. And of course, they did what they do best, and they counseled him out. They said, go to public school. They can help him there. And I did as I was told, because I didn't know better. I'm a first-time mom. And his first year in public school was absolutely horrendous. From the kid was bedwetting to being felt in the classroom like he was stupid. I remember one time I went to parent-teacher conference, and the kid, I was like, where does he sit? I'm always interested where my kids sit in the classroom. I was like, where's their desk? And she was like, it's over there. It was pointing to the front of the chalkboard. And I'm like, why is my kid sitting by himself? She was like, well, this is the best place I can keep an eye on him. He's very distractible. He needs to be kept alone. So that's just one experience. And then I started having I had my second child. And because I already started to pick up on what was making him struggle as a child, I immediately knew my second boy, was also dyslexic. And trying to convince the school leadership that he had a disability was literally the most enraging experience of my life. I was told that I was being overly dramatic, that I needed to calm down, that I should just wait until, my kid learns to read. And some kids learn to read in 3rd grade, and that's totally fine. Except that's totally fine for a family that has the resources, and they will be fine. But I'm raising brown boys in the country where if you don't know how to read, the likelihood of you going to prison is exponentially higher. So I had a sense of urgency that the school did not. And what ended up sort of, it opened up this whole another thing for me where I then had to arm myself with legal jargon, had to arm myself with like facts and articles. I would show up to IEP meetings that have to happen every year for accommodations for your child when they have a learning disability, with art, like a binder full of stuff, because the resistance to get the support that my children needed was so real that I remember vividly there was a standoff between me and the school psychologist when the school psychologist did not agree with when I did not agree with her dissertation of what she needed to do. I literally told her, I took off the rest of the day. I will sit here all day. I got nothing but time. I will not sign that paper. We will not do what you want. You're going to do what I want. And she thought she can get over. She did not. But, and it turned out that the reason she didn't want to do it my way was because she needed to do another battery of tests that she didn't want to do. It was more work. So that has sort of showed me how absolutely difficult it is to get the basics that children need in this country, but not just any kid in this country. It's kids of color. And it's been a continual struggle with my little guy who's 11 and is severely dyslexic, and trying to put him in a space where he can absolutely read. And it's hard because the school system is not built for children like him. And these are, I have 3 of them in my home who have a diagnosis. And to get a diagnosis requires resources. A neuropsychological, that's thousands of dollars. And then the advocacy part that is incredibly tasking. And that's just, and I speak English. I'm well-versed in the system, and it's overwhelming for me. So I know for a fact there's tons of children out there who are not diagnosed because they don't have the resources, and the parents just don't have the capacity to deal with it. So, I think that sort of what propelled me into the space of advocacy, because I was dead set that you were not going to do this to my kids. No way, no how. And I was going to set my foot down immediately. And what I started to see is that teachers treated kids differently. So my kid was always labeled the lazy one. He didn't work hard enough. He's not living to his full potential. If only he did this better. But they never saw him for the creative individual that he was. Like in art, he like created amazing things. When he was, then he moved on to clay. He would create these crazy, things that someone with a disability flourished when it came to creativity. But he was never seen for that. He was always seen as the kid that would not could not read a single word on the page. Because of that, kids, tend to compensate. So my kid was a social butterfly, was always talking to kids, was the class clown because, when you need to, when you have to deflect the negative and turn into something else, but it's just incredibly frustrating because I'm just one person with 3 sets of stories for 3 sets of brown boys. I only imagine the stories that are out there because, and we can go on and on and on about this, but this country does not recognize dyslexia as a thing. And we all know that reading is literally a fundamental civil right. And then we want to talk about the achievement gap and why the kids aren't scoring well. And oftentimes who is not scoring well are students of color. And because they don't have the resources, it's like a perpetual cycle that
and I want us to get into some of those issues overall in the system, because I think you kind of set that up. I wanted to kind of bounce to Shino and again talking about your experiences as a parent and how they've translated to what you've seen your children kind of experience and how that's played out. And then I definitely want to come back to you to talk about some of the other things that we've talked about in terms of some of the quote unquote special programs that schools seem to teach to track students and how that has created another set of systems. But Shino, please.
So my foray into this work it's white adjacent middle class mom story, right? You're supposed to step up to do the PTA. You're supposed to volunteer at the fundraiser. You're supposed to do all these things if you are a good parent. That's sort of the narrative out there. So clearly I fell into that, which isn't a bad thing because I started doing this work. So I started with a fundraiser at my older one's elementary school and then moved on to the PTA. And then from there, that was right around the time mayoral control of the school system happened in New York City, and No Child Left Behind was kicking up. So it was a convergence of this education reform movement. I call it reform movement because that's what it is. They call it reform, but it wasn't a reform movement. It was the education reform movement happening at the national level and really unfolding at the local level under Bloomberg. So that was really actually what catapulted me into more citywide policy arena activism. That's when I started doing I don't want to say opt out because we weren't opting out, but it was about anti-high stakes testing, trying to move away from standardized testing as assessment tools, preserving the budget, because right around that time, shortly after, we had the economy crash and all that. So that was sort of how I entered this space. And it wasn't until much later when I started thinking about what do schools look like in my own district, and noticing that, oh, our schools are actually segregated. And I'm not quite sure what drove me to that question of looking at the racial demographics. I think it partly is because there were a lot of people talking about it. And when I got on the local school board, Community Education Council District 2, I met Naomi's predecessor from District 1, Lisa Donlan, who was an amazing activist. And she was about school integration. So I learned a lot from her, and just being in the same space with her just opened my eyes to how segregated our system was, particularly in a place like District 2. So that's really how I switched my activism, or I should say I didn't switch. I expanded my activism to really center racial justice as the central issue of our times, whether it's about school budgeting, small class size, standardized testing, or actually integrating schools to culturally responsive pedagogy. All of those initiatives that I'd been working on was really about racial justice and creating a racially just public school system. So it's been an evolution. And if you saw me 15 years ago as an activist, I think you would not recognize me. I was a very different kind of an activist. And I'm actually proud to say that I have evolved and I have learned and I'm becoming wiser and I'm becoming more well-versed in the racial justice work. And I guess that's actually a good perspective because it gives me the humility to see other people and recognize their journey. So, just because somebody was really a horrible, clueless person 10 years ago, I wouldn't necessarily write that person off today. If there's evidence that that person has done the work to become a better activist, then yeah, well, that's me too. So people do change. And that's sort of what I try to hold on to. Horrible people today, maybe they're capable of changing too. I don't know. We'll see.
I think you address a couple key points. There's this evolution of engagement, and how do you actually drive change in a system that's so embedded with the same kind of folks who have thought the same way for years and years, never accounting for the changes that demographically are taking place in the system, as you said, Naomi, really being blind to the fact of just outright inequities of who has access to the tools they need for their kids to succeed, and the barriers in which are imposed, either in and we could debate whether those are intentionally or just because it has been done to create easier paths for others, but that's a bigger conversation. And Camille, I know you've talked a fair amount about the role that gifted and talented programs have kind of played in school systems, which again, as a newspaper reporter, I covered schools back in the early 80s in Miami, and that was a conversation there. And certainly being in DC and now in Dallas, the evolution of gifted and talented and magnet schools and all these various things that have evolved into lotteries and specialty schools within public school systems. Anyway, Camille, please talk about this because you have a fascinating story related to this.
Yeah. So when my children entered the public school system, similarly to the stories that other people have had, you hear that, oh, this is the best program and you have bright children and they should be in that program. And, my husband and I sort of followed like sheep, not recognizing that these track programs are just methods of segregation in the school system. So both of my children were in gifted and talented at our zoned public school. But it was always very confusing to me from the start about why the classrooms looked so different, why there were so many white children in the G&T program, and there was like a very clear separation of, you sort of look in this classroom and it's like mostly white, and you look in this other classroom, it's mostly black and brown. And that was really alarming and troubling to me. As I, tried to learn more about why on earth this was happening, I spent a lot of time reading about the program, learning about the history of the program, and although it had been designed in the 70s as a method to support child prodigies, children that were so brilliant and had talents in sort of one or two specific areas, but then had a lot of trouble socializing. They are virtually our twice exceptional children, the high functioning children on the autism spectrum. And that is who this program was developed for, yet it turned into something entirely different. It basically became a way to keep privileged families in the school system, particularly white families that were looking for a private school education within the public school. What I witnessed was that the children in the G&T program were learning more, they were doing more, they had more field trips, they had more access to everything, more enrichment. At the PTA meetings, you would hear families from the G&T saying, "Oh, if I give you money for a French teacher, can we have French lessons in the G&T class?" And other families that were more equity minded would say, what are you talking about? You don't create programs specifically for one group of families. And so it was really just an incredibly challenging time to have these conversations and to be in the classroom witnessing a lot of this. In all of my years, I just continued advocating to create more inclusive classrooms. And some of the really, really unsettling things that happened over the course of these years is I actually saw Black and Brown children pushed out of the G&T class, just being told that they don't belong there. Just like people saying, "How on earth did you pass this test?" Just insanely offensive. And I saw two children in particular that were bullied out by their white classmates. It's really quite disgusting the way that the Black and Brown families were treated that were in this program. And, and then coupled with the fact that the program just absolutely could not and would not service children with special needs. So these twice exceptional children that should have been benefiting from this special program that was designed specifically for them, could not survive and basically were counseled out or pushed out. And people ask me, why did you keep your child in that program? Why didn't you just pull out? And I think that there is a lot of value that can be had by being in the center of this. That voice of advocacy can often change the entire group dynamic. And in some ways I was successful, in others I was not. But on our exit of the program, we had an incredible principal that found every way that she could to commingle the students across the grade. And I believe that was making an enormous amount of success in this particular school with creating, a one mind, one school mentality where everybody benefited from the programming. Now, of course, this is a system-wide program, and without people advocating for change in admissions policies, the programs will vary from school to school to school. And that's why you'll hear a lot of people telling different stories about their experience in this program. But the high level of it is that any program that uses a single test as a measure for admission is going to become segregated. It's just inherently programmed in that way. And so I'm happy to say that the Department of Education is discussing a really deep dive into making changes to programming the gifted and talented, and I hope that a lot of equity is going to come out of that.
Thank you. Do you think your children or others' children notice this discrepancy in who was in the classes and who wasn't? I mean, was there any sense that the students even had a sense of how uneven this was?
Yeah, I mean, I think the students could recognize that, especially as they got into the upper grades. They can talk amongst themselves and ask, at the point that they're in third, fourth, and fifth grade, they can have these conversations about test prep and access to information. They're well aware of the privilege that each other have and the disadvantages that other families are at. I was thinking about what Sheena was saying before, this idea of, for me, it read as like the ability to forgive. And I think that this is very important. When we're having these conversations about these challenging situations and we think back about choices that we have made and, sometimes like you're hearing a lot of voices all at the same time and you're not sure which one to follow. And sometimes you follow the wrong voice. And I think that it's really important to keep an open mind about those are things that I did in the past. This is who I am today. This is, how I'm thinking today and what I'm going to do to change thought patterns and become a better person and make this place a better place for all people. And, in and out of our lives, we're going to meet people that think differently than we do. It's really important to, kind of understand where they're coming from and their backgrounds, because all of these things have just shaped our thinking. And this is one reason why it's so important to have anti-bias training and just be very, very aware about, the things that you're saying, the actions that you're making, and how they're impacting other people, like all the time. It's just work that isn't going to end. And as people, we just have to make a commitment to that, to have the work ongoing, even just in our own self-development. I just thought that was important to mention.
No, thank you. And Naomi, as we were talking about gifted and talented, you were mentioning experience that your own child had encountered in schools. Please share that with us. And Sheena, I know you wanted to dive in, so please dive in. Go ahead, Naomi.
Yeah, so my son attended a school in my district that had gifted and talented classes across every grade. And at the time, they had 3 sets of classes per grade. So it was a G&T class, a class like his that was ICT, where it's, integrated co-teaching, where they had 60% of the kids had IEPs and 40% with general ed. They also had a general ed class, and in some grades they had a 12 to 1-to-1. Whereas more concentrated for children who have more specific needs that can't be in a larger classroom. And, in his school, it was very, there was a very clear shift that was happening. My son was older, so his classroom was a lot more diverse. But by the time my second kid came in to the school about 4 years later, it was not looking the same way. It was really more white. And it was so clear. It was night and day, like really very drastic. And I would be in those PTA meetings where, you know, they're talking about like, you know, we need chess. I have a friend as a chess, you know, master. Let's bring it in. Let's, you know, and I just remember I would converse with these parents that are from G&T that, you know, lived in a neighborhood, but they lived in a different set of buildings, in the co-op buildings, in their, you know, fenced off co-op buildings with doormen. And there was a sense of like entitlement that they often had. And very much even with parents, you know, when I would say where I lived, they're like, oh my God, which co-op building do you live in? And I would say, no, I'm actually across the street in these buildings. And again, the face that I've been used to for so long of my lifetime, their face completely changes, where they realize, oh, this is a different type of parent. And I remember, you know, as he got older, I would ask him, you know, I would ask my son, I'm like, you know, why aren't you friends with any of these kids? And he would tell, I was like, what, you share a lunch period with these kids, you're in the same schoolyard for period with these kids, like, why aren't you friends with at least one of them? And he flat out told me, he was like, those kids won't talk to us. They only keep to themselves. And it really was interesting. It wasn't until he went into middle school where the middle school system is not, there's no G&T for middle school. It combines all students together. I remember he came home with a white friend. I was like, oh, who's this white kid? Like, oh my God, this is great. And he's like, oh, he went to my school. He was in G&T class. I was like, dude, but you went 5 years without knowing who he was. And like, now you're friend. He was like, yeah, we're in the same class together. So now like we're friends. And I just felt it was incredible. It was so mind boggling to me that we've created these structures that exist where, you know, and I personally feel like also creating a class where you're telling children for 5 years that they're gifted and talented, also creates sort of a psyche that, you know, that there's a sense of superiority that they have amongst the rest of the students. And that gets translated even on the schoolyard.
Yeah, so many levels to the idea use the word psyche of how these systems basically are creating the psychological awarenesses within our children. Some very obvious and some very intrusive and very, you know, I think, you know, as much as some of these kids will never admit that years from now they'll realize, oh, that's how it was ingrained, the way they thought about each other, right? And so much what you all have said today is about how your childhood experiences shaped the way you viewed the world, and how now your children are experiencing how this is shaping their view around the world. And what makes you all so fantastic is like you're able to kind of immediately see what the heck is going on and say, okay, wait a second. Shino, you have a great story to tell along these lines as well.
Yeah, a couple different stories. So I think it's perhaps because I grew up in an unconventional family, a profession. My father was a high school dropout. He finished his Japanese equivalent of a high school diploma at a night school. Never went to college, but he's very successful as a writer. My brother never went to college because he's a musician and he didn't want to go to college. He went to a music school after high school. So I growing up, I didn't think of this high school to college and academic path as the only path for a meaningful, happy life. So when my older one was in kindergarten, the principal of my local elementary school came up to me and said, so are you going to be testing your child for G&T? And I said, no, why? It's like, well, your child is smart. It's like, well, she's smart, but she's not that smart. I mean, this whole notion of a kid who is maybe above average, largely because of the socioeconomic status and the books that I read to her because I was able to and all that stuff, that she might qualify for gifted and talented just struck me as so ludicrous. I mean, that label should really be for the, like Einstein smart, right? 1% of the population, kids who really just get something the way other kids don't. And even for those kids, that doesn't, just because you're a whiz in one particular area doesn't make you a whiz in other areas. So this whole, let's segregate kids based on some bogus metric of measurement, of some bogus notion of giftedness. We're going to segregate them every day, year in, year out. That just makes no sense to me. Yes, my kids are gifted, but in areas that are unconventional. They have both a really deep understanding of human relationships. And that's not something anybody tests on, right? But I can tell by just interacting with them, they are able to understand, empathize with other people, and manage human relationships in ways that are nurturing and healing. So, yeah, that's giftedness, but we don't value that. I also know plenty of artists who are amazing artists, but yet we don't label them gifted. So this whole notion, it just really boggles the mind. But I had the opportunity to teach environmental education, because that's what I do as a day job, in an elementary school that has a gifted and talented program. 2 classes were Gen Ed, the other 2 were GNT. Racially divided, you can tell which ones are GNT, which ones are Gen Ed. So I had a conversation that, when I felt comfortable enough, I had a conversation with the teachers and I said, do kids know what's going on here? And these are 3rd grade students. The teachers said, absolutely they do. They call the GNT classes the smart class. 3rd grade students, they already have that label. And the flip side of it is, kids who are in the Gen Ed classes think of themselves as less than. If that is not inhumane, I don't know what is. Why do we do this? To make a whole group of kids feel inferior when they're not. So, don't get me started on GNT. But what I really wanted to talk about was this whole notion of, oh, Camille, you have kids in GNT. Oh, Shino, your kids went to a screened middle school and screened high school. So what? As an environmental professional, I fight climate change. I fight environmental degradation. But I still have to function within the system, right? So yeah, I don't use straws anymore, but that's not going to change the system. Systemic change isn't necessarily about individual action. That's actually a fallacy created by the corporate structure. Oh, it's this, local action, individual action, and think globally, act locally, individual actions matter. Actually, that's not how systems change. I still fly when I have to. I still drive cars when I have to. I have to function within the system, but that doesn't rob me of the right to fight to change the system. Yes, I put my kids in a screened school because I carefully selected those schools. I actually looked at the demographics. They happened to admit students by a screening method, which I didn't like, but the school actually had the demographics I was looking for and the culture that I was looking for. These schools were actually actively engaging in dismantling racism within the school by training faculty, by having spaces where students can talk about racism within the school. So we still have to function within the system, but we can dismantle the system from within. And I just really irks me when people come after your personal choices within the system to discredit you. No, it does not discredit me. It does not discredit Camille. I mean, how else would we have admitted women into Ivy League schools? There are men fighting to admit women into colleges. That's okay. That's how change happens. So I'm on the soapbox, but I just wanted to say that because that's the criticism I hear all the time. Oh, and this is part of the backlash that I'm experiencing in District 2. When we really started talking about school desegregation and school integration, that includes hiring teachers of color, implementing culturally responsive pedagogy, and restorative justice, and all the things that the three of us and more of us are fighting for, the backlash from the white and affluent, shamefully Asian families has been really fierce. And they have co-opted the language of racial justice to fight against what we're trying to do. And I don't really have an answer to how best we've moved forward, except to keep moving forward. But it really is quite a spectacle that I see in District 2 unfolding, where these people come out and they talk a good talk. They say every student deserves high quality education. You have to fix K through 8 before you change the high school admissions, or give students what they need. But if you just scratch the surface, you'll get to the place of, I am going to hold on to my privilege, even if it kills me, right? They really are reacting to having their privilege taken away. And they don't understand how participating or perpetuating this system is robbing themselves and their kids of their humanity. Why would they want to continue the system at the expense of other people? To what end? There's just so much anger and hurt in these people. I really do wish that they go seek help at the emotional level. And this is something that I'm not saying lightly as a joke. I really do. In my meetings where these people speak during the public session, they need help. And our meetings, public session, ain't it. That shouldn't be the outlet. I don't think they leave our meeting after they say whatever they say in the public session. I don't think they leave these meetings feeling good or happy. And I just, this whole attack on the critical race theory, which is not even what it's really being taught in our schools anyway. They're twisting the meaning of what that is. And these so-called Manhattan progressive liberal parents are aligning themselves with really conservative right-wing think tank people. I don't know what that's all about, but the backlash is really strong, and we have to come together stronger than ever before, form alliances, solidarity, and all that good stuff, and really step up our game.
Well said. Well said. That is really, flows into so much of what we've been talking about, and really where I would like to go, and as we look at what you're fighting for, and you guys have articulated some of those, but really some of those, the tips and advice that you get, you want to give to other parents. And children along the way to kind of feel that passion.
This is a Black History Fact, brought to you by Dannie Gore and the New 3 Rs. Mary S. Peak, the colored teacher at Fortress Monroe. Mary Smith Peak, born Mary Smith Kelsey in 1823, was an African-American teacher and humanitarian, best known for starting a school for children of former slaves. The school opened in the fall of 1861 under what became known as the Emancipation Oak in presently Hampton, Virginia, near Fort Monroe. This is a Black History Fact brought to you by Dannie Gore and the new 3 Rs.